Alrighty. Okay. Let us get going. All right. Ooh. Okay. So we finished off last time talking about kind of classic management paradigms. We're going to move today into kind of new management paradigms. Um, really, couple of really quick notes. My pen is not working. That's fun. I don't know why. Okay. Out of there for a sec. See what's going on. Okay, so a couple of really quick notes. I am working actively on your exams, right? So I'm kind of chipping away at them. They should be coming along anytime here. Um, so kind of keep an eye out for the marks. And if you want to talk about them or go over the exam, my appointment booking system is up on Canvas, and you just find a slot. I don't think I have anything left for this week. People have completely booked it up. But for next week, there should be lots of slots available. And hopefully I will get everybody's marked by end of the day on Friday, which is my goal, right? So roughly 2 weeks from when you wrote it, everything should be marked. Uh, yeah, we got basically three little units left here until the end of the course. So we're going to talk new management paradigms. Hopefully today, probably finishing up on Friday if we don't finish it up today. And then into unions and kind of finishing off with stress on in next week. Stress, work satisfaction and stress, a really short unit on that kind of combined thing. And then we will be done. So yeah, we're very quickly closing in on the end of this class for y'all. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is the same Q&A thing as forever, and reusing it over and over again. So if you have any questions, do throw them in there. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit new management paradigms. So especially kind of coming, through the 1980s, people start to shift out of these sort of old school Taylorist frameworks and moving a little bit beyond even human relations. And they're trying to find better and better ways to make work more enjoyable for people, to make, workers more productive by, in a lot of ways, making them happier. And that is a lot of the goal that people have in designing these new systems. The other goal is obviously to make the best products possible, because product quality really, really starts to matter. And this is where we come into Japanese management, right? So Japanese management through the 80s and 90s is all the rage. Um, it is one of those, if you go back to the literature of the time, everybody is talking about, and pop culture, everybody's talking about Japanese management. And why? Well, in the 1970s, right, we've talked about the 70s before, the Japanese car companies, especially Toyota and Honda, but especially Toyota, come into the American market, right? And their cars are known for exceptionally high quality, right? So really high quality. And, low fuel consumption, which ends up being a big deal because, you're going through an energy crisis in the 1970s. And they vastly outcompete the American car makers who are caught really flat-footed, right? So by the 1970s, the American car makers, are in a phase where they're making cars like the Barracuda, the Mustang, the Challenger, the Charger, the Super Bee, right? This is the muscle car era. But suddenly, and some of these cars, right, like the Barracudas had an 8-cylinder engine in just a car. They're basically like drag racing cars. And then you get an energy crisis. The Japanese come in with things like the Civic, the Tercel, and the Corolla, and they really are these super fuel efficient, little cars, and people start to buy them in really large numbers. And there are these anecdotes from the 1970s and 80s where you would show up to the factory, the Ford factory or the GM factory, and the parking lot is full of Toyotas and Hondas. Because even the people working at those factories, even with the factory discounts, are still buying these Japanese cars. And there's a ton of, shall we say, problems. The American car makers try to pivot into making smaller, more fuel efficient cars, and it goes just terribly. The most famous incident in this is a car called the Ford Pinto. And the Pinto has this really unfortunate design flaw where if you hit it from behind, like you rear end it, the fuel tank on it tends to explode, to catch fire and explode. We joke about it now as like Ford Pinto as this incredible sign of poor design and poor management. Ford knew about it, but they judged that the number of people who died would be smaller than the amount it would cost to recall the cars and fix the problem, because the problem was pretty fundamental to the design. It's like where the fuel tank is sitting on the car. And so, you get this problem. Now, people start really looking at Japanese management and the way that the Japanese work their system as a possible explanation for why the Japanese come to dominate the car industry, right? And Toyota and Honda go from like also rans, especially Toyota, to eventually passing General Motors as the largest car producer in the world, right? So, oops, there we go. A big change. Okay, so a couple of things about Japanese management, right? Japanese management has particular styles. So things like it has a really, really highly evolved internal labor market, right? So Toyota, the idea at Toyota is that you would, seek lifetime employment with Toyota. This Nenko in Japanese, right? You would be a Toyota man or a Toyota woman, right? And you would spend your whole life working for that company, basically moving up through the echelons as you prove yourself to be a competent worker. All of the promotions, right? Seniority-based wages and promotions, right? Everything moves up in seniority. The longer you've been there, the more you move up. So the more experience you get at the company, the higher your wages are. So putting in that time at Toyota, right? Even if you're not necessarily moving up in the company, you're still going to get wage increases just by measure of being there. You're also, the longer you've been there, the more likely you are to get promoted. And Toyota, implements kind of constant training and retraining. Okay, now that's part of it. The big thing that makes the quality at Toyota really interesting is this one. I guess all of these things, like these three. So they create, basically these sort of informal work groups within kind of Toyota. So whenever, you're working on something, you're part of a sort of informal work group that manages one particular part of the process. And the big thing that they implement is what's called quality circles. And the idea here is that you listen to your employees, especially your employees that are on the ground, kind of manufacturing, the vehicles, and have a lot of experience manufacturing vehicles. Why? Well, the idea is that they will catch things, problems in the production process, and they can point them out to you before they become problems, right? So, if you look at this is kind of a little graph of what Japanese management looks like. So what they want, right? Advanced quality prevention. The idea is to stop quality problems from happening, right? And how do you do that? Well, one of the ideas is quality circles. And basically all this is like once a week, maybe on a Monday, maybe on a Friday, right? Whenever it happens to be, the whole team that's working on a process, right? Let's say you're building the engine for the Toyota Corolla. You guys, honestly, it sounds dumb. Everybody stands around in a circle and management listens while the employees tell them, any of their concerns, right? So it's like, I think these welds aren't going to hold up. I think this, the way these pistons are built, the piston rings are going to shoot out, or the seals aren't going to be good. The idea, of course, being right? If you can catch this problem when you've built maybe 100 Corollas and then fix it, you'll stop the problem from going out to customers. So you will stop costly recalls, right? Because recalls, especially for car companies, but for anyone, right, are incredibly expensive because you have to bring the vehicles back in, bring the product back in, fix it, or refund the customer for this, right? So quality circles help with early detection and early resolution of problems. So whereas something like the Ford Pinto or any number of American cars, right? Like this, and this problem with American cars goes well into the 2000s. I remember, what was the car that my friend had? Ironically, his last name is Pinto, but he wasn't driving a Pinto. I think it was a Chevy Cavalier. Um, and it was the only car that Consumer Report ever gave a 0-star safety rating to. They're like, this thing is essentially a death box. Do not buy it. Yeah, because it was such a problematic vehicle. The American car makers never really figured out how to build good small cars. And eventually, like now, they don't even build cars anymore. They just build trucks and SUVs. So, Japanese management, right? You want to catch problems early and solve the problem quickly so that you don't get major problems in the production process. And yeah, I mean, if you catch the problem, you try not to generate the same problem again, right? So anything that comes out of the quality circles, management is then supposed to take up to, the designers, the engineers to say, hey, we've noticed this problem. So in future workflows, right? Like, we got our 2025 model of the Corolla. Um, our workers have pointed out this problem. Make sure that in the 2026 you redesign this part so that that problem doesn't persist, right? So you get the quality circles, and it sounds dumb, just people standing around and saying like, "Hey, I noticed this, this problem in the engine." But for Toyota, it was one of the things that differentiated them and made it so they didn't have these big quality problems. And this was, what they call ringi or participative decision making, right? Employees got a say in how the processes worked, in terms of what problems should be addressed. Oh, the other thing that's always interesting at Toyota, if an employee noticed a problem, they were encouraged. They all had like these big buttons that you could shut down the production line. Basically, you're like, okay, I think this is such a big problem that it's going to cause a safety concern. You could go whack the button, and it immediately stops the production line and triggers a discussion where it's like, okay, what are you seeing? Why have you stopped production, and what do we need to address, right? And employees were encouraged to do that, whereas like the American car makers are like, yeah, 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 whatever, just build the car like we told you to, right? And you get different results out of it. Okay, along with this, right, these highly evolved labor markets and lifetime employment, you encourage, a ton of commitment and loyalty, right? So that people kind of link their identities with the brand, right? So you're a Toyota man, and again, this is maybe a quirk of Japanese culture, the amount of loyalty that people had to the companies they worked for. But it was, you were supposed to take pride in how great of an employer you had and make that part of your identity as well. So you're supposed to stay there for a long time, have tremendous loyalty, and care about the output. Okay, so obviously, people notice this. Um, and people want to emulate Japanese management. Now, a lot of Japanese management in some cases does seem to be linked to Japanese culture, right? The Japanese have a very particular culture that tends to make this work really well. But so nobody really manages to, import Japanese management techniques wholesale, like into companies like Ford or General Motors or Boeing, right? All of these companies, and a lot of the American electronics firms that try to take them on end up going bankrupt. And great American electronics brands like RCA end up being just bought up by companies like Sony and Panasonic and just used as badges. So nobody really manages to bring this into North America, but they do bring some of the innovations of Japanese management into the field, and I'll talk about a couple of them. Um, okay, so one of them is just-in-time delivery and inventory system.
The way that traditionally, like say, an automaker like Ford would have worked is basically they would produce, to their part supplier, they would produce just a crap ton of parts, right? And they would say, okay, we think we're going to build, I don't know, 500,000 F-150s this year. So produce for us the parts for 500,000 F-150s. And they would store these things in these massive warehouses, right? Parts warehouses in the factory. And when you needed parts, right, they would be brought in from the warehouse. So these big logistics chains, right? And a lot of storage, a lot of time. The Japanese firms, right? Toyota's famous for this, especially, and now we see it a lot more. We can talk about some contemporary examples of it too. I have one in mind. Um, we talk about just in time, right? So instead of warehousing stuff, okay. Let's differentiate between push and pull logistics. I think I talked about this, before. Push and pull logistics, right? So push logistics is something is produced, it's sent to a warehouse, it's stored, and then you use it up, right? You try to use it up as much as possible. Pull logistics is when demand hits, then you produce a thing, right? And it goes and you use it right away. So there's no storage, right? Like, so the way this worked at, say, Toyota was, let's say you needed spark plugs, right? At the Ford factory, they would have had like boxes and boxes of spark plugs pre-produced. For Toyota, it would have been like, okay, so next week we are building 15 Toyota Tundra trucks. So we will need the spark plugs for those 15. And they put out an order. The person who manufactures those for Toyota builds them and sends them. And there's no storage, right? They come to the factory, they're immediately used, right? So this is a just-in-time system. And basically, this is all managed by computers, right? So basically, the computer knows when you've used up or what you're building and it orders, so you put it in, I'm building 15 Tundra trucks, and it sends the order. Obviously, it's not 15, right? It would be like hundreds or thousands. But it orders those things so they arrive just as you're using them, right? So it cuts down on managing inventory because the inventory shows up right when you need it and you use it immediately. There's no storage time, right? Um, okay, a couple of here. So this is what's called pull logistics, right? You pull from your suppliers what you need immediately. Okay, there's a couple of really interesting ways that this has gotten kind of gotten used. And one of them is Walmart. Walmart adopts this just-in-time inventory system, and it actually, sorry, just in time, and it actually is one of the things that for a long time now their competitors have now kind of caught up and they emulate this, right? Target in the U.S. I don't think Walmart really has any competitors left in Canada. Maybe Superstore. I don't know. But what do they do? Okay, so when you go to Walmart and you buy a tube of toothpaste, um, basically you go to the self-checkout, you swipe that tube of toothpaste, and immediately that goes into their logistics system. And whenever that system says, okay, the South Edmonton Common Walmart only has 17 tubes of toothpaste of Colgate gum detoxifying toothpaste on the shelf, it automatically sends an order to Colgate, right, or Procter and Gamble. So without anyone touching it, right, without any human being interacting with the system, the computer is like, okay, there are 17 of this, they're selling at this rate. So we know that we're going to need, another shipment of this kind of toothpaste, and it needs to be at that store on this day. They send that off to Procter and Gamble, and automatically, right? It automatically goes into Procter and Gamble's computer system, and Procter and Gamble immediately ships that to the right store. So one of the things that Walmart never has really had was these big warehouses where they store stuff, right? They have these distribution centers where, like, for every store in Edmonton, Colgate toothpaste will show up and then go out to their stores on that pull system, right? Where basically it knows how much each store is going to need. It knows how fast it's being sold, so it can calculate when that shelf is going to be empty and when it's going to need to be replaced. Okay, so that's one way. And that honestly was one of the things that made Walmart so successful is they figured out this just-in-time thing So they were always ordering basically just what they needed, not having a bunch of stuff that they would then have to put on sale, um, and just pulling it from the suppliers rather than having the suppliers sort of push it. Costco does this as well. I guess the big competitor for Walmart is Costco. Costco has an amazing just-in-time delivery system. Like they know down to the unit how much of this stuff sells, when what store is going to need what, and it basically goes right out onto the floor, right? Because you see it, right? It's right in there. So that okay. Other example of just-in-time, Lockheed Martin. So Lockheed and the F-35. Sorry, the F-35 jet, right? The one we're about to get, maybe. Um, this is so sophisticated with the F-35 that basically it has an onboard diagnosis system that tracks like how worn out a part on your plane is going to get, right? So let's say like the blades in your turbofan engine are getting worn out because you've hit a certain number of hours, and it's like, I've marked a 3% decline in the product or in the performance of this engine. I'm going to order these 5 parts, right? And so then Lockheed sends that to the airbase where it needs to be fixed. Nobody ever stores parts for the F-35. They get sent on a pull system, which is a just-in-time production system, and it's supposed to be super efficient. I mean, there's some problems with the F-35, but that's the idea, right? And it's, again, meant to minimize storing parts, having parts sit in a warehouse and people losing track of them. You get the part you need when you need it, and it's all based on these really sophisticated computer systems that are tracking everything you do. Okay, so we talked about quality circles already, so I will not repeat that. We know what that is. Lots of companies have tried to implement systems like quality circles, right, where they listen to employees. And that's the key with quality circles, is rather than management being like, we know best, you listen to employees and hear their concerns because, the idea is your employees are closest to your process. And so if you listen to them, you're more likely to catch problems in your process early on. And then, strong organizational cultures. I'd say this has been the biggest challenge with Japanese management in North America. Creating really strong organizational cultures that are cohesive, where people have commitment and loyalty, especially, in an era of outsourcing and downsizing, has been a big challenge. But certainly, we've seen just in time, I think probably the biggest one that's coming to North America, and all sorts of places use it now. Okay. All right. So kind of on the other end of the spectrum, right, we can think of the Japanese systems in a lot of ways as being super efficient, right? There are these systems that are meant to, automate and make the kind of production process really, really, really precise. Other places have gone different ways, right? And especially places like Germany, places like Scandinavia, have really, I guess, essentially tried to figure out different ways of increasing productivity that are less about kind of like automating the system, making it more efficient in every way, right? Less just in time. We'll talk about lean production. That's a particularly American thing, a very, very dehumanizing one, apparently. But the Scandinavians really have focused on the humanization of work. Um, and there's lots of ways that this has happened, but I think probably, these two essentially are the more important ones. So, one of the things that's kind of Swedish work reforms and other Scandinavian kind of work structure reforms have tried to do is to flatten organizations, right? So, your typical organization is kind of like a pyramid, with the CEO at the top and a bunch of workers at the bottom and a bunch of layers of management in the middle. The idea behind a lot of kind of work reforms is to make the distance between, your worker and the CEO as small as possible. You see this with a lot of tech startups too. A lot of tech startups are kind of based on this idea that you should have a flatter kind of organizational structure. So instead of all these layers of bureaucracy, right, you would have the CEO and then you would have the employees, just below, or maybe one layer of management instead of multiple layers, so that your organization is flatter, right? There's less of a hierarchy to it. There's less distance between upper management and the workers. Okay, So you redistribute your power relations, right? More is given to workers, more, say in how things are produced, how quickly, what the processes are, and these sorts of things. And yeah, you try to give them better access to upper management so they don't feel so alienated. Okay. Um, skills development and satisfying work. And I guess this goes along with kind of socio-technical work design as well. One of the things that a lot of the Swedish work reforms, I guess you saw this at Volkswagen as well for a while, um, is they basically tried to redesign work so that it would be more rewarding, right? And especially by not eliminating all jobs or really focusing necessarily on automation for everything, but trying to take the worst jobs and automate them. So the famous example in like car manufacturing is the paint booth, right? And a lot of the welding that happens like under the car, a lot of those things are very repetitive, they're arduous and sometimes dangerous and a little bit hazardous. So what you do is you take those worst jobs and you redesign them you automate a lot of them, but you still try to keep as many kind of human touches in the workplace as possible, right? So you really try to avoid cutting jobs too much. You just cut the jobs that are boring, tedious, and arduous. Okay, so now these are interesting examples because both of these companies have struggled a little bit. So Volvo had a really interesting kind of setup at its Uddevalla factory in Sweden. And it was basically set up, instead of an assembly line, they restructured their car manufacturing. So instead of an assembly line, right, with very repetitive tasks, they actually took the chassis of the car and sort of moved it around the factory floor and created workflows how workers wanted them to be. So they created these like, how do you want to work? How do you want to build, this particular part of the car? How do you want to put the engine in? And all of these things. Now they were still highly automated because they had robots moving, the cars around the factory floor, but it was meant to be a much less kind of assembly line, like dehumanizing system. And yeah, autonomous work teams at Saab. So Saab builds a bunch of stuff, mostly aeronautics. They used to build cars. I don't know if they still do. Like one of the jets that Canada was thinking of buying was the Saab Gripen. We didn't end up ordering it, but they still do build fighter jets. And the way this works is every team, like, so, whatever job your team has, whatever part of a process, you're autonomous. You get to design that process and figure out the best way to do it for you, right? So, basically allowing people to choose their own jobs and giving them very little oversight. And here, when we talk about stress, one of the things we'll talk about is some of the more stressful jobs you can do are the ones where someone's breathing over your shoulder all the time, right? The more supervision you have, and other things like auto pacing, if machines are pacing you, those are really stressful jobs. And so by doing these sorts of things, right, allowing people to set the pace of work, have quotas that they have to meet, and letting them figure out how they're going to meet them, that autonomy tends to make for happier workers. Okay, so I just want to check if there's no questions. Okay, cool. Oh, good. Quality of working life, right? So again, um, kind of an outgrowth, another kind of way of thinking. How do we get more productivity out of people by improving their working conditions? It comes out of human relations research, right? That same research we were talking about last time that happens in the 1930s, the Hawthorne experiments and all the things that came out of that. And the goal, right, was improving employee satisfaction, motivation, and commitment. Why? Well, the idea is higher productivity, better quality products, and therefore bigger profits, right? So the idea, really, I would say through the 90s and 2000s was if we can create better working conditions for people, they will work harder, we'll have less production problems, we'll have higher quality products, profit. Okay. So again, we see some of this coming out of kind of that Scandinavian stuff we were talking about, reorganizing worker involvement and decision making. And they try to implement these things in different places. One of the very famous ones is the Shell Oil's Sarnia chemical plant, where basically they allowed the workers to sort of set their own pace of work, set their own work processes to see how it would work. And it did increase productivity for a time. Okay, what are the kind of basic ideas in quality of working life? What is it that they try to do? What is it that they think people will enjoy? Okay, so one of them is what's called job enlargement. Okay, so expanding a job horizontally, adding related tasks. So basically, right, let's say you're in charge of one particular thing. Job enlargement would be to kind of give you more things to do, right? More things along a process. So I don't know, let's say that you're, oh, I'm trying to think here, in charge of, putting together an engine for a car, right? Instead of just being, responsible for one little piece of it, tasks would be added to you along that process, right? So you would get more tasks to do. The idea here being that workers really like variety, right? Doing the same thing over and over and over again is really boring, a little bit dehumanizing, and sort of makes you hate your job. So if you have a little bit of variety in the tasks that you're doing, now here, right, in this kind of job enlargement, it's all within one kind of process, right? Um, so you're not, moving through different processes. You'd still be within one particular process, but that you're gonna have, you'll know kind of mentally that you're getting a break from whatever task you're doing as you move to that next task. So just having that little bit of variety in your day tends to make people a little bit happier. Okay. Job enrichment is more adding additional tasks from other parts of the production process, right? So rather than being, all in one related task, for maybe one day a week, you would go to a different part of the production process and do something different. Um, you know, or you move through different parts of the production process during your day. Again, this is all with the idea that variety is the spice of life, if you will. It makes it more interesting and more engaging if you know you're not going to be doing the same thing all day, right? If you're just doing the same thing all day, it gets really, really boring. Job rotation, again, pretty simple. Rotating through jobs. So, maybe for 1 month you're doing, one part of the process. For another one, you move to a different job, within the company. Maybe one week you're in design, the other week you're in quality assurance and quality or QC, quality control, QA, quality assurance, quality control, right? You would move to different jobs. Now, the value here for workers is you get variety, but you also develop skills, right? And for workers, that's valuable because you can use those skills to sort of make a case that you deserve a promotion, right? You can use those skills to pivot to other jobs at other companies. If you're stuck in one little task, right, it can be really hard to develop skills that you need to kind of move forward. So by rotating people through jobs, they get, experience in different parts of the process, more experience. They're happier. Again, they're not doing the same thing for months at a time, years at a time, decades at a time, right? They can see, okay, next month I'm going to be doing this different job, and that is good. Okay. I guess all of these kind of go together in a sense. We'll talk about them, all of them. Again, you see quality circles, right? So QWL, again, imports this from Japanese management because it works, right? Because it's a good way of catching quality problems. Okay, autonomous work teams. And we talked about this with the Swedish work reforms. Yeah, you put small teams, generally pretty culturally cohesive because they work together for a while in charge of specific operations, and you basically make sure management only deals with something like, okay, here's your quota, you need to build, 55 engines this week for our cars. We don't care how you do it, just design your own process, figure it out, and hit that quota. And then management sort of butts out, right? So the groups are left very autonomous with very little oversight. And yeah, flatter organizations, fewer levels of management. Now, this has a kind of a double purpose, and I talked about it, on the last slide. It's meant, A, to make workplaces seem less bureaucratic, but B, also to shorten the time that it takes for a message to travel up, right? So let's say at your workers, they're like, hey, there's a problem with this process or with this policy, or, Steve is the problem. It's Steve that's causing all of our problems. It has to be Steve. It's always Steve. Damn Steve. Um, in a traditional organization, right, with that pyramid structure, okay, so the workers will tell their manager, but that manager doesn't have any power, so he has to then go up to his manager, who also doesn't have any power, who has to go up to HR and then up to the CEO, right? And that takes time. Now, if it's just, let's say your employees, two managers, and then the CEO, that message can travel up, to the decision makers much more quickly, right? So they can make decisions, right? That's the advantage of flatter management structures, less hierarchy, faster communication, right? And sometimes, right, these folks might have sort of, our employees might have daily interactions with upper management, right, with the CEO. And so they can just go tell them what the problems are without having to go through this chain of management, right? And that has benefits, right? Management gets firsthand accounts of what's happening rather than like traveling up these elaborate hierarchical chains. Okay, and the last one, an obvious one, is pay for skill. Workers get paid increases when they learn new skills, right? So again, related to this, right? If you do job rotation or if someone goes off, and say, I don't know, does a weekend course at Nate, in AutoCAD or drafting. Does anyone do AutoCAD anymore? Or is it all AI? Okay, you do? Okay. I'm like, has that task been automated yet? I have fears. Okay. Well, you go and you learn AutoCAD, right? And you bring that skill in, and management's like, hey, well, now you've got that extra skill. Here's a raise, right? And they recognize that. Okay, so a lot of this is, in practice, but this is the design or the idea of quality of working life. Implement at least some of these things to, again, give workers more control, more autonomy, more variety, and make for happier workers, right? Okay, now how does this work um, in practice? Often not that well. So, often the kind of changes to worker tasks are minimal. And I mean, here, we have such a division of labor in most modern workforces that most people are really specialized, in their particular tasks. And so moving people around, to different tasks, teaching them new skills tends to be a bit of a drain on organizations, right? It requires, at least initially, a lot of time and effort. So often, the actual implementation of this is a little bit lip service, right? It's like, okay, we give this person 3 tasks instead of 4. There's also sometimes, workers will actually resent the additional tasks, right? So you might be thinking, and this, where management and workers sometimes don't communicate well and don't see things the same way, right? If you go back to something like, job enlargement, clear my slide, and sometimes workers will perceive job enlargement as actually overloaded, right? Where instead of being like, oh, I get a variety of tasks, they're like, wow, I have more stuff to do every day, right? I'm now being loaded up with more kind of jobs within this rather than seeing it as, what it's intended to be, which is, giving them a little bit of variety, right? So you can imagine if you're doing your one task, um, you're doing the drafting in AutoCAD, and then your management adds 2 other tasks to you. You're gonna be like, great, more work, right? And you might not perceive it as your boss is being like, we need to enlarge everyone's jobs to give them more variety. You might just resent it, and that tends to happen. Okay, yeah, management, and this is how these things often work, especially when you get people like management consultants into firms, right? They're going to be like, okay, we've got this great new thing. We learned it in management school, right? It's called QWL, and this is how it works, and you're going to do it. And then the CEO is like, yeah, QWL, that sounds great. and nobody ever talks to the workers about whether they think any of these things would be valuable. So it's like, we impose, we're doing this new management thing. It's called QWL. You're all going to love it. And workers are given no say into whether any of this is something that they would want to do. And so what happens is, for a little while, they're like, okay, and then they start to resent it and sometimes resist these kinds of quality of work life programs. Often it's perceived, like I said, as really about new ways of kind of trying to motivate people to work harder, faster, especially if some of this stuff, right, are job enlargement and enrichment. If it comes, say, with layoffs, and sometimes it does, right? Because the idea is we're going to make these organizations leaner. So we're going to, we're going to enlarge people's jobs, give them more variety, give them additional tasks from other parts of the production process. People are like, actually, this is just about getting, more from less, right? It's really about just loading more work onto me at the expense of other people that got laid off or someone retired and now I've inherited their jobs, right? Okay. Um, there's sometimes, you don't see the direct output or the direct link between kind of workplace injuries, illness, and quality circles, right? Um, they're meant in some ways to kind of reduce processes that would be dangerous as well, not just about increased production, but people don't often make that connection on their own, right? They tend to see a lot of things like quality circles as all about this, or good for the company, but not good for them. Okay, and success and failures in Canada. There's been lots of failures, but one thing that we've seen in Canada generally, um, for employees, a lot of times like higher satisfaction, but we've seen a kind of long, kind of 15 to 20-year trend in Canada of declining productivity. So, while workers might be happier and more satisfied with their jobs, they're not necessarily, you know, producing more. And so a lot of these kind of QWL practices often led actually to declines in productivity rather than increases. And sometimes it's seen as a way of undermining union bargaining power, or the ability to form unions by bringing in these reforms to kind of defang union demands. It's like, well, I mean, you can't ask us for any more, right? We already implemented these quality of working life things that are meant to address all of your concerns. So again, meant to kind of defang unions, and we'll talk about unions in probably early next week. Okay. TQM, or total quality management. This is another, you know, kind of marketing consultant or organizational consultant buzz kind of term that people, started to use kind of in the 90s and early 2000s. Okay, so QWL, sorry, follows QWL techniques, but its focus was a little bit different. And the early 2000s especially really had this weird kind of shift into this kind of dynamic, right? Where the relationship between workers and their employees, right? So you had your employees, you had your, all right, let's say, I'll put workers, employers, starting to include this aspect of the customer, right? Where a lot of kind of the buzz started to be about satisfying customers, right? And continuous improvements in quality of products or services, right? So this happened in all sorts of spheres, right? A lot of the stuff we've been talking about so far is in things like manufacturing. Um, but TQM was really big in the service industry as well. And like looking back on it, well, nobody was really taught using the term TQM at the time. If you were kind of alive and working in the kind of mid to early to mid part of the 2000s, you can recognize a lot of these sorts of trends that were going through corporate workplaces. So things like, satisfying customers. You know, I remember, and again, I don't want to bring up my enterprise rent-a-car experience too much, but the goal was 100% customer satisfaction, right? That the goal was, oh my God, I'm having nightmares in real time. Um, that the goal was that every customer had to be completely satisfied, right, with their rental experience. Which, by the way, is super depressing because when you know that that's impossible for a lot of structural reasons, and you know you're going to get judged on it, you had this. Okay, so one of the things that a lot of companies implemented, and this was enterprise, was customer surveys, right? You still see a little bit of this, right? Every receipt from every store now has the chance to do like a customer survey to give feedback. My favorite one is from Shell, or any gas station, because I literally like pull up to the pump, you know, I use an app to pay for my gas and then I leave and then I can do the surveys to try and win gas for an entire year. And it's like, how was the customer service experience? It's like, well, there was none. I pulled up to a pump and filled my own gas tank and left. So great, I guess. That's like my favorite way of buying gas. I don't know. But right, it's built on this like, okay, we have to completely satisfy customers, right? Customer satisfaction is the kind of holy grail. And the goal is kind of continuous learning, right, on how you're going to improve products or services, right? So the implementation involves customer feedback, right? So you actively kind of elicit customer feedback. I know at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, I don't know if they still do this. I really hope they don't because I feel bad for the poor schlubs who still work there. They would send out these random phone surveys, right? And they would call and they would ask, one single question is, were you completely satisfied with your rental experience? And if not, you could give your actual feedback, like, in words as to what went wrong. But they were soliciting specifically direct customer feedback. So to try, so they add the customer to this triangle of power, and then management, when it's not 100% customer satisfaction, really leans on the workers to try and figure out why. Okay, so yeah, the employee is key to identifying and resolving problems. And in one way, this sounds really nice. In other ways, a lot of times there's a lot of pressure on workers to try and figure out what happened, or to how shall we say, be always triaging customer service problems, to try and get ahead of them, right? Oh, anyway, I remember this was the enterprise rent-a-car thing. Whenever anyone returned their vehicle, you always had to ask them, was there, or how was, no, wow, I don't even remember the question now. I've blocked it out of my mind. But essentially, you ask them like, how was everything with your rental experience? Is there anything we could improve for next time? It was so irritating. Um, I'm still irritated by it all these years later. But right, you were the key to identifying the problems, and you were supposed to jot these things down. And at the end of the week, you were supposed to write a little report, right, as to what you learned that week about customer service. I was the worst at this because I'm a bad person. Okay. It might also involve teamwork, increased worker roles and decisions, and other QWL like initiatives, but often it sort of stays in here. And especially with this and management then leaning down on workers when customer service scores sag, right? So, okay, I'm out of time. We'll leave it there. We're about halfway through, I think. We'll assess TQM next time. We'll see you on Friday. Yeah, we'll easily get through the rest of this on Friday, and then we'll move into unions either Friday or next week on Monday. And we should easily get through the rest of our course content. Okay, let me check if there were questions. Darn it. Okay, yay.